Hello, and welcome to the 2024 series of clay seminars and workshops. These have been convened by the Ceramics Research Centre at the University of Westminster in the UK, New York University in the USA, the Indian Ceramics Triennial, and Kwame Nkrumah University in Ghana. And my name is Claire Toomey, and I'm part of the team at the Ceramics Research Centre in the UK. And today I am lucky enough to be the host for this workshop. The theme for this workshop is Material as Catalyst. And I am super excited to welcome two very, very important artists to speak with us today. That is Linda Sormin, who is joining us from New York in the USA, and William Cobbing, who is joining us from his studio in London. Firstly, I'm going to ask each artist to make a short introduction about their practice, what they do. So, Linda, if it's possible, I'll hand over to you to start your introduction about what you do.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks so much for having us. It's such a delight to be in conversation with William today. And we began talking to each other while our hands were covered in clay. So this feels really great. And the invitation to, dig into our stores of clay and work while we talk just feels really natural, doesn't it? As we met at the European Ceramic Work Center in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
I am an installation artist. I work primarily in raw clay, ceramics, and mixed media. I use found objects. I go and, a friend's basement might give a couple of roosters. I find bits of imagery and historical fact. So I've been really looking at these found ceramics of my Batak Indonesian ancestors who were using found Thai, Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese pots in their spiritual practice. So, for many years I thought, oh, this is something that I'm, discovering, using and upcycling raw found objects. And I'm finding through history that it's something that is in my line of familial practice. So I'm taking the ideas and experiences of contemporary life and finding clay as the interstitial tissue that kind of holds them in space in installations in a museum that often will include and invite the voices of people in the community to work with me as I build. And recently I've been trying to tell stories maybe more directly with text, writing, but also spoken voice recordings and talks with my father and other family members. And all of these little fragments of information have been coming into my work, very much like fragments of clay, shards of porcelain or bits of earthenware, kitschy objects, and also cast items, and bits of paper and drawing has been coming into the work as well. So having a diasporic experience, my experience of being born in Thailand and then moving to Canada when I was 5, and then moving back and forth across borders as I work and live in different places. That experience of upheaval and change and transformation seems to be embodied in the way that I approach ceramics and installation. William.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much, William. It would be really great to hear about your practice. Thank you, Linda, for describing your story.
I was wondering if there was going to be a prompt. So thanks so much for inviting me, Claire, and I'm so excited to talk to Linda again. And after starting a conversation with her in Holland in the summer of 2021 when we were at the European Ceramics Centre. So just briefly, as a kind of form of introduction to my work, I do things like I have stuff here in my studio. So this is kind of my new studio. It's a video studio, and I also have a ceramic studio at home. But I have things like this. I kind of make clay extensions of my body, kind of larger, like kind of exaggerated limbs. And I'm interested in things like the interface with technology. So imagine trying to do a text message with this kind of big gloopy clay hand. I also do things like envelop performers' bodies in clay, and they manipulate this material kind of blindly. So the process of working with the raw formless material is kind of forwarded. So all my kind of objects and my videos all involve this kind of misshapen clay, and it's very much about taking it back to the idea of materiality and thinking about the idea of how we can let clay do its thing and have agency and autonomy. And then also, I suppose the idea of I've got some kind of clay here. The idea of how clay sticks to us and it extends our body. So, and compared to solid objects and things like that, if I was to pick up a solid object, it would be very much separate from me. But already this clay is kind of doing something else. It's kind of joining onto me. And then I could also, I can then join my mobile phone. It's just a sort of way of connecting things, I suppose. So yeah, that's sort of what I do.
It's fantastic to have such to have your introductions in your studio is a real privilege. So really, thank you so much. And it's my job now to lead you into. We have 4 questions. You may just stay on the first question for your entire conversation that will probably lead on for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, but. In this theme of material as catalyst, then the first question I'd like to present to you both, and then I'll disappear, is how can encounters with clay access a multitude of senses? I feel that you've already started that discussion, so I'm going to disappear and leave you to get on with it.
Thanks, Claire.
Linda, do you want to kick off? Yeah.
Me? Okay. I was just going to say, I just love the fact that we are able to touch and move, not be behind podiums or something, but the fact that we're touching and moving material just in that way that feels so much an extension of how understanding the material and experiencing the material is not just something we do with our eyes and our brain, but something that we can just, experience through the body. And I think the first way that many of us experience it is through smell, just walking through a muddy puddle or by a stream, just walking, in a rural area, and, you can hear running water, and then you have this kind of earthy smell that comes to you. And I think that has been the most kind of powerful pull for me. You open a bag of clay and you still get echoes of that wild clay, something that's found in a place that that it naturally occurs in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would, in terms of senses, add, for me, obviously, touch and haptics are really important. So certainly when we're thinking of clay, the idea of our fingerprint in there, and the fact that it makes a kind of a pockmarked surface, like the surface of the moon or something like that. And I guess, and then the other sense that's kind of important to me is so the sense of sound as well. Sadly, I don't have really wet clay on me. But as soon as clay gets really wet, it gets quite sticky, and you get a kind of a puckering, sort of squidgy sound, which I guess I also relate to sort of ideas of ASMR. You have some, Linda, amazing.
A bucket of water, but that sound.
Yeah. Amazing, perfect. I don't know, and Linda, how do you find that sound? How does it sort of, how do you react to it? You like it or no? Or
I mean, I think it's one of those things where moisture, things that are wet, can either send people in different directions, right? There's a sense of if
yeah,
something's moist or wet, we could feel like maybe a rush of tenderness or of
yeah,
even, there's an erotic charge as well.
yeah,
But there could also be for some people kind of like revulsion. It's like, oh, it's, you know, I know people who they can write about clay and they love, you know, thinking about it, but they don't want to touch it because the way it hits your fingernail, it gets under your fingernail, something like that. But for me, it was definitely something that I just felt like I could let my sense of touch fully extend in a way that I couldn't with other media. You know, when I was trying painting or printmaking, I love other media as well, but I never had this sense that my hands were completely, like you said, you know, in this experience where the elements just change it. So, you know, when we're playing with something that's fired, you
yeah,
get this, there's
yeah,
that really lovely vitrification that you talked about, a resonance, you know, a certain kind of
yeah,
resonance. And that is something I've been recording lately in different, you know, hitting it with different implements. But then this sound, like that you pointed, I love that you pointed that out, has this other kind of really something related to the body. We kind of we kind of ooze in the same ways.
yeah. Yeah. But Linda, I totally agree with you in the sense of, I mean, I actually think a lot of people who come to clay via that idea of that squidgy sound, it's actually experienced that conflicting emotion kind of simultaneously. The sort of attraction, the fact that it's a very sensuous material, and but then also the fact it's quite sort of abject and icky. And I quite like the quality of it, which is you sort of feel those conflicting emotions at once as well. But yeah, but also thinking about the idea of, I'm really glad you mentioned it, the idea of um, fired clay and the resonances and the sound of that, and also the fact that a kind of an earthenware or a stoneware or a glazed, or obviously the different types of fired clay produce different resonances as well. Just very quickly, a few years ago, I made a video work about that referenced the Tarkovsky film Andrei Rublev, and at the end of the film, one of the central characters makes a bronze bell, and so I did a version of that with a ceramic bell, and it was so exciting to get, and then once it had fired, get that sort of resonance from that as well. And also thinking of things like ceramic ocarinas and the idea of fired ceramic shapes having a volume which produces obviously sort of acoustics and sound as well.
Yeah, and that sense of wind, you know, it's very
Yeah,
rare that a material can evoke all of those aspects of, you know, something wet, something that has wind, that gusts, you know, but we're super aware of those things when we're trying to, you know, dry clay or to keep it moist. You know, how do we collaborate with it or work with it so that it's not running away from us, you know, leaving us behind when we're trying to work with that malleable state. But I also really love what you mentioned about the different kinds of clay and the different resonance that they have when they're fired and also when they're wet, you know. So I brought like the porcelain and the stoneware, and I meant to work with the porcelain when I was, my hands were still, quote, you know, clean. But of course, I gravitate right to the red clay. There's something about that earthy openness and that, you know, porosity, not only of its clay body structure, of its ceramic structure is more porous, but also I think the cultural resonance that it has for me working with clay is maybe closer to where I live in my making process rather than the porcelain. Although this has this kind of seductive, fine, really silky texture, when it's fired and working with it, it has a very different kind of behavior. I think that's one of the exciting things about the things that relate to sense and behavior later, things that we can touch and feel and hear and smell and even taste are in tension with perceived notions of how things should be, what's appropriate behavior for porcelain, or for someone working in porcelain, what's appropriate behavior of a clay body that's about to, change from a liquid to a solid, and then a solid unfired piece to a, goes through this kind of traumatic heat, another kind of sense. We sense so much of the ceramic process, that heat, that extreme trauma that the material must go through before it becomes permanent in some way. I like how it travels through all those stories. It just tells, so many epic dramas as it moves into its different facets of being.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely agree. I'm definitely really interested in the idea of a sort of red terracotta clay, or a clay with a high amount of kind of, I guess it's iron in or something like that. So I don't have any here either. So, it would be really nice if I did, or I've got some around the corner. But the idea of when you work with a really red clay, that in the same way that clay sticks to you, the kind of pigments come out into sort of one's skin, the kind of the dye, and so you actually, it sort of stays with you and becomes part of you again, which is one of the really nice things about clay. I mean, I always do think of clay in terms of the idea of flesh or skin or something like that, and that that idea of it having a duality, or a kind of a sort of a sense of there's a good sort of interplay between those two things. Linda, one of the things I picked out from what you were just saying was the idea of whether how clay behaves, and it made me think, especially observing your studio in the European Ceramic Centre. A lot of what you do is playing with the idea of clay misbehaving. And I wondered if you would like to say something, if that's something that might resonate with you, and would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a place that I think our practice, both of our practices kind of meet in this point of kind of delight with transgression of how things are supposed to present. And I think that mine really comes from being raised in kind of parallel cultures, one religious and maybe one craft-based, that taught the right way of doing things. So when there was a proper way to work with porcelain, or a proper way to work with different kinds of clay bodies, or perceived proper way, I learned those. And I think that the traditional way of working with things is so informative, because you get to embody thousands of years of practice. And that's, I think, really meaningful and very exciting. But when it becomes dogmatic, I think that's where the need to resist that, the heels just kind of dig in. It's like, I mean, I was reading books, texts in school that said that, they were, kind of gendering the way that quote, male and female practitioners should be working with clay, and one would be more physical, one would be more intellectual, all of these kind of really unhelpful, limiting, and basically wrong ways of presenting the possibilities of being with this material that can come to life in ways that go beyond any kind of dogma. And I think even, the way we characterize clay bodies, going back to that kind of characteristic of, or that perceived notion of porcelain as clean, there's a lot of kind of racial and colonial language and perceptions in clay culture, history, that I am really interested in unpacking. So I think the first time I really started to talk about that and feel it strongly was in the UK at this white gold symposium that in 2005 that was about porcelain. And I just heard through the conference, a lot of language around purity and transcendence, and a kind of a superiority of porcelain, the white clay body. And that, I mean, that struck me as super telling, and how in studios we even want to keep, tables clean and have the red clay and the non-white clay bodies not contaminate. These small little bits of language that are embedded in the way that we behave with material, and that kind of physical aversion. If you're working in a certain color of clay, that certain kind of aversion to another kind of clay polluting that I think is informative of how we need to renovate the way that we construct our approaches to material.
Yeah. Wow,
to be an anti-racist kind of thing, just to say it, you know, barely.
No, sure. That's so interesting about the white gold, and then thinking about the sort of red and white clays and sort of contamination. And I guess another thing picking up from what you said was the idea of a sort of gendering of clay as well. And I've been reading a little bit of recently about there's a super writer called Petrolan Burns who's written a book about materiality for MIT Whitechapel, and talks about I mean, this is sort of quite in the discourse anyway, but the idea of materiality in terms of the word origin coming from the word sort of mother or maternal, and thinking a little bit about, so gendering it in that way, but thinking about the idea of that subverting the way in which particularly sort of sculptural work or also ceramics has often historically been a more sort of, I suppose, macho idea of the clay submitting to the diktat of the artist or the craftsperson. The idea is it submits, it sort of takes the shape that there's a sort of like a godlike idea of like I will submit sort of material, and then but then if you take it back to the idea of materiality or matrix, there's this sort of idea of as I mentioned earlier, sort of the idea of agency, giving material agency. So instead of it being this is material, it will submit, to the idea of this is material, let's have a conversation. And then hey Clay, what do you want to do? Like, how are you doing? Like, how are you feeling? What shape are you feeling like you want to be today? And that's very much the approach I take. It's in the sense of thinking of I want clay to kind of be clay, not what I think the clay should be as well. So sort of thinking about that. So in that sense, that's where I maybe come to that idea of sort of misbehaving. I want to engage with the material when it's at that sort of breaking point of where it goes out of my control and kind of like collapses, and a lot of my performances are about the clay just sort of splurge or kind of popping out or something like that. There's a super artist, Shiraga Kazuo, whose performance from 1955 is Challenging Mud. It's one of the early Gutai group Japanese performances, where he talked about I wrestled with material and it won. So it's really going against the idea of mastery of this material. It's the idea of I suppose understanding that it's gonna, it can kind of defeat you. And my sense is he was pretty happy about that.
Absolutely, that really resonates what you're saying about the agency of the material, but also of it being performative. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that. What is it like to inhabit one of your performances, and what are the ways that we can understand clay to be performative?
Oh yeah. So I guess I think sort of really interestingly, the way I came to performance is also maybe links in a little bit to what you were saying about from the sounds of it, you're saying that you learned all of the, you're sort of supremely sort of skillful, and you've gone through a kind of a real sort of technical ceramic kind of a sort of education and experience, and to a much lesser extent, because I've never studied ceramics, but I did sculpture, and I made quite a few fired ceramics, so more traditional objects. The sort of period of rebellion for me was when I was in art school in Holland, in Amsterdam Ateliers, where I accidentally did a performance, or I sort of accidentally on purpose did a performance. Well, not even that. I know I, for some random reason, thought I'm going to put a bit of clay on my head, and then took some photos and then made a video, and then felt sort of really kind of embarrassed about it, or sort of sheepish about it, or it just didn't compute with the way I thought about art. And so I just hid it for a long time, and didn't think about it. And then it ended up being quite an important piece, but it took a while to sort of get used to. But anyways, to cut a long story short, it's thinking about, I suppose, the process of making and the haptics and the idea of negating a final object in performance with me. It's I love making so much, why not make that the thing? And so in that sense, you need a time-based element. So a live performance or a video, or maybe even photographs as well. And so that was sort of my way into it. And then just sort of very quickly thinking about senses. The work for me is about experiencing the sensory deprivation of clay on me, enveloping me. And it really, and I'm lost in my own thoughts. And exactly, Linda, as you were saying, I get this lovely smell of clay. And as my breath is sort of inside this helmet thing, it's kind of mixing with the clay smell, and it's just really, it's kind of, yeah, it's really absorbing. And then again, I'm just much more aware of my sense of hearing and sense of touch. So that's, yeah. And how about you with performance?
It's amazing how you go through a sensory deprivation in order to feel that be aware of the full aliveness of the smell and everything. But it's this tension between what's cut off and what's withheld. And I think that for me, that kind of really resonates with how, being in growing up in a culture where the body was denied so many things, including, pleasure and freedom in so many ways. I think that, waiting so long to come to a material that then gives you so much feedback when you touch it. There's weight, there's mass, there's all this physicality that you can embrace in a way that goes beyond metaphor. Of course, it's metaphor and it's meaningful in those ways, but there's also this, just immediate kind of feedback, but also, observing how the material changes, and watching demos happen, being trained by really amazing, skilled, visionary people as they're throwing on the wheel or as they're hand building. Those experiences were so much about how much I wanted to learn those skills and to embody that kind of knowledge. And I think that's a really important part of it too, is like gaining that kind of affinity with the material and learning it so well that you can have an intimacy with the nuance of its poetic potential. And that all comes through touch, a certain kind of gesture on the wheel, or the way you lay a slab, and those kinds of really subtle things. I wanted to also explore the underbelly of that. What happens when things go wrong? Because so much of my experience in the world, I worked in Southeast Asia as a development worker. And so I saw a lot of people under stressful situations and dealing with a lot of issues of survival. And to me, the world didn't seem to match up with the model of modernism, of things coming together and making sense. To me, everything was chaos and things were so vulnerable, and life, in so many situations was at risk. And so how could my experience through material embody that sense of precarity and unreliability and that being on the verge of collapse? I wanted to find a way to stretch the language towards reflecting the realities that I was experiencing. And so a lot of this happened in ways that didn't have the skill and the skills weren't helping me tell that story. And so, at night, I remember in grad school, I would turn the lights off because I didn't even want to see what I was doing. Shame is a really interesting thing to explore, when we're talking about skill and the pride, that comes from, learning something really well and knowing how to do something. Well, there's a lot of shame in the opposite. So I would turn the lights off, wait till everybody was gone, and I would do like things that I was ashamed of, like throwing things across the room in a certain way, or, performing things with the clay physically and allowing it to move in ways I didn't want other people to see. And I was almost too embarrassed to acknowledge that it was happening, but I needed to do those things to invite that kind of unscripted conversation to happen in my practice. So when I'm doing an installation now, I often try to pivot when I feel too comfortable, or if there's a fluency that maybe comes across as too glib for me. I try to find another gesture, like how can I turn from something being open to being closed, from being domesticated into being something unruly or disagreeable, aggressive even. So, behaviors that ceramics isn't necessarily acknowledged to have, although it has those behaviors, that ceramics can be weaponized, from, knives to nose cones on missiles. I think ceramics isn't the domesticated creature that we tend to slot it into. And so, but having all of these historical references and then giving a chance for my own ego to get out of the way of those things. There has to be a sense of openness to my own behavior being unpredictable, I think. And I think that clay has been an amazing partner for me over the years and inviting that kind of misbehavior, professional and artistic.
Linda, that was so great to hear about that. Also in the sense of having the privilege to see your working process at the European Ceramic Centre as well. So I really enjoyed visiting your studio and all the things that you're saying. So the idea of chaos, precarity came through both in your visiting your studio, and then every few days there'd be a kind of a development. There'd either be maybe a kind of a collapse or a rebuild or something, or as you say, an intervention, and the idea of this sort of narrative flow. And for me, it always felt a little bit like a kind of a dance studio or a theatre or a theatre set or something, because also the scale that you were working with was person size or bigger than person size. So some of your structures were I don't know, getting up to about 3 meters or something like that. You were much more ambitious with scale at the European Ceramic Centre than I was. So I was quite I was in wonder in terms of coming into your studio, and then even to the extent where there's risk because when you work in such a big scale, like getting that ready onto a kiln shelf to go in a kiln or something like that. And then the thing that works really well, so just even seeing you making now, is that idea of the precarity converts really well from, I don't know, this process that's hidden to most people to actually finding itself in your final ceramic object as well. So yeah, I guess one question, it might be a bit of an annoying question, but do you show much of, I know, because again, I had the privilege of seeing you make at the European Ceramic Centre. How important is it for you to show this process, or do you think that your objects are like embody that, give clues or hints enough about that?
So far, it really has been, like you say, when I'm showing work, whatever that means, it has been kind of hints and clues of the deconstructed process, so people can see when a part has gone soft or collapsed or given way, and you can see when something is turned. So what used to be the bottom, once it's fired, could then be then changed once you turn it in the kiln. And there's a clue for that if people kind of tip the orientation. So I've really been engaged with that dialogue of where things are, what can stand, and what you can hold by yourself. There's something about the scale of things that indicates what can you do on your own. I think our very first, kind of one of our first longer times in the studio together, when I came to your studio, I'm like, can you help me? I can't hold this thing up. This thing is, and you helped me, craft a wooden support, an armature that I wasn't able to technically do myself. And I'm so grateful for that. And early bonding in the studio, that because I was desperate, but part of the excitement for me is, and performative aspect for me, is to also perform these things that put me in a vulnerable place. You know, I'm not performing something that I'm assured of success. Like, I don't know if this is going to work out. There's, it's dubious at many times. And so, and it's also collaborative and performative. And that is another way of having things have this kind of unspoken conversation, you know, like, so, you know, you're helping me to lift that corner of the piece up, allow the next steps to happen. So I think there's something being performed there that is also, it's metaphor, but it's also social practice. It's a community kind of engagement that's very traditionally ceramic as well. And I think that that's something that I'm excited about in your work too, how relationships become performed through your clay work, both in how you have performances where you're working with the clay and another body is there and a human is there. And then also in more theatrical sets, like plays almost, where there is one or two bodies and they're enacting something in relationships. Can you talk a bit more about how human relationships become performed? I think that's so powerful in your work.
No, sure. No, it's something it's super important to me. I guess there's two different ways, I guess, thinking about working with the materiality and body is I like clay things to join people together, but I also like clay things to give this sense of joining people to the earth. And I suppose, again, it's about the idea, my last exhibition I called Social Substance, and it's thinking about that idea of clay taking away the idea of, perhaps the idea of individual identity, because my clay figures and my clay people, the individual identity is effaced. So you don't, you get this kind of amorphous sort of formlessness. But so in that sense, I suppose, as opposed to individuality, you get the idea of a kind of like a common, a common shared materiality, or somehow the idea that I'm really into the idea of what of the earth once we're gone, once humans aren't here, and instead of thinking about, I don't know, there's a real sort of sense of, in terms of a lot of the stuff about things about the environment and stuff like that, it's sort of it's a little bit of, I know there's quite a sort of condescending attitude to kind of like the earth and stuff and material. Like, the earth is going to be fine, materiality is going to be fine. We're gonna sort of go in, we're going to sort of end up in sort of material. So I suppose thinking about the idea of how, I'm sorry, I'm really not explaining myself very well at all. I suppose thinking about the idea of how we're linked in a kind of rhizomatic way with each other and with the earth and material. And I really like that. And I think that idea of relativity is really important. Maybe against the idea, I'm really going off on a limb here, maybe the idea of, against the idea of a sort of capitalist sense of the individual, perhaps. Maybe it's something like that. I'm still really thinking through, I mean, I don't necessarily make work with these specific ideas in mind, but the more I do it, the more I'm seeing links with what I do, I suppose.
Well, that's where the work can kind of start to grow the ideas, you know, it's not the old kind of paradigm of having an idea and expressing it through the material. It's as you work, it's starting to inform the way that you position yourself in the world. It's like the clay repositions you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think you catch up. I think, I mean, I've gone through things like a sort of PhD and stuff where I sort of felt like I had to justify my work before I made it. And that didn't really work. And I sometimes think allowing the material, and clay is such a great material to do this, allowing the clay to just kind of, I mean, literally go with the flow of the material, see where it takes you, and then have a go about thinking about it, but then realizing that that's quite a shared thing, that again, even as the artist, you don't have full agency or autonomy over an understanding of your work. I don't think. I think it's, again, thinking about the idea of sort of social substance, the idea allowing it to be sort of in the world as well. So,
and it connects,
yeah.
The process connects me in a way that theorizing about it doesn't. You know, I thought that this year, as I take, you know, a year away from teaching on my first sabbatical, I had this, you know, idea that it would be a time for reflection and writing and research, and it has been. But the thing I've missed most, what I thought I needed a break from everyone, I'm kind of hungry for the engagement and the way that, you know, we're adjacent with other beings as we lift things into the kiln together, as we, you know, make our way through the studio in a communal way. Of course, solo time is good, but I think I really gained so much inspiration and energy from that kind of enlivened relationality. And, you know, what you said about the rhizomatic way of envisioning relationships, how we're all kind of connected in those ways, is definitely something that's been embodied in my work through these grid structures. So having, you know, these grid structures then hold small mementos, and often someone will come from, you know, their own studio and drop a bit of trash, ceramic trash, in my studio, and have, you know, little bits of their own story kind of connect to mine. That is, for me, it seems a really natural way of having our different stories overlap and intersect.
Yeah. Can you tell us something a little bit? I don't know. I've got no idea what I'm making here.
Oh, me either. This is site responsive.
Yeah. So that idea of trash, and I noticed again in Holland, this idea, and I read something about a kind of a mindset you have of not throwing away stuff. And again, when we were in Holland, you threw a lot of like stuff that's broken stuff into stuff that you were building. Can you tell us a little bit about that idea of trash or recycling as well?
Yeah, I think it relates really strongly to, you know, how we value things. Just like one kind of clay body is supposed to be valued more highly than another clay body, I also kind of want to dismantle those kinds of you know, discriminations against things that we think are important in culture and not important in culture. So, you know, I might find like a little tiny piece of there's a little papaya here that is from a market in Jatuchak market in Thailand. And it's a little tiny kitschy object, but it tells a story, but it's, you know, worth, you know, cents. And then having it in this kind of abstract sculpture that might be made with another kind of artistic intention or cultural intention that traditionally has been, you know, this is an important abstract sculpture, and it exists in kind of a Eurocentric kind of framework of understanding what's valuable. I like to mix what is valued in culture and some cultures and not in other cultures. This way of using gold leaf is another way that kind of reflects my experience growing up in Thailand. At the Buddhist temples in Thailand, a sacred spot in the temple on maybe a Buddha figure itself, or maybe in a doorway, a lintel on a doorway, you could take a piece in the small villages, you could take a piece of garlic and rub it and add a little a piece of gold leaf to make merit, but it's not handled in the same way as European gold leaf. So it's not trying to be permanent. It has this sense of ephemerality. So a bit of wind, a gust of wind comes by, or a little breeze comes by, and all these little bits of gold leaf kind of reflect the temporality, the impermanence of things. And that really affects me strongly. And then other things like working with family or with hobbyists, I'll go and make an installation, preparing it in a kind of a hobbyist ceramic studio. And I did this at the Norfolk Potters Guild in Canada. And I brought my family in, which is something I don't usually do. And we rolled out slabs together, and my dad was writing, you know, verses in clay, and I was, you know, kind of rolling them up into these tubes. So the languages of different points of view, different generations, the things that we have to say to each other, the things we can't say to each other, can kind of be rolled into these pieces in ways that aren't predictable when I start those kinds of conversation. But I just kind of am interested in the kinds of things that can unfold when we are doing kind of what we're doing now, just kind of working together and letting the physicality of engagement with this material that kind of opens up another kind of being together. another kind of community, sense of community.
Yeah. So this maybe is a good moment. I think one of our questions is about audience, I think. So in relation to that, Linda, how do you feel your audience kind of encounters your work, or how might you like that to happen in terms of extending what you've just been talking about as well?
Yeah. When I imagine an audience, when I'm making an installation, I'm imagining other people there, people's presence in the space with me. They're not there yet, but I'm hoping they'll come and be part of the process of bringing that piece to life, or that experience to life. So, if I take a piece like this and then I'm stacking it over here, and another piece comes on top of it and then gets stacked over here, there's this sense that there is tension over here, there's weight over here, and then I might put something overhead. So something will be, here, and then there's a spot where you can walk underneath. So that sense of someone understanding the work by standing under the work, I think that the underbelly of the work kind of shows a vulnerability, even though it's a heavy, maybe sharp, aggressive looking piece of ceramic. By having someone invited to experience this space, I think the space underneath things activates a kind of thing that wouldn't happen without the audience there, if that makes sense. So I'm making an experience that needs people to be part of it and to respond to it.
And also sort of by the sounds of it, subtly, I know the way you work with space and ceramics, these sort of networks, you're prompting your audience to kind of move in a certain way as well, even if it's just to sort of follow around, or as you say, to look, to kind of look underneath. Because of this, I guess, because of the scale of some of your works, it does require the viewer to really go on a actually, I know, to sort of view it in quite a kind of personal way, and actually to kind of move their body in terms of looking underneath or around the side or through or something like that seems to be quite important as well.
And they're performing something when they're doing that. When someone's on their knees, they're performing something. Like, it's not that specific, but it could feel specific. If there's a hole in the floor, like in Mass Mocha, the artist before left 3 large holes from their installation, and they were repairing them. The team at the museum was, and I'm like, wait, no, they're found holes. Let's, so I kind of, found a way to put insert videos down into the basement, so you could look down into these, holes. But when someone's looking down, they're performing and also experiencing something that we all experience when we look down into something deep and dark and, kind of away from us, moving away from us and moving down there. And it's a kind of curiosity that's activated. So I think that, it's a call and response kind of possibility that I really am excited that you mentioned dance, because that's something that, like, I was at the Paris International Des Arts, the Cité residency, and I saw art, but I also couldn't stop going to, I saw 3 dance performances in 2 weeks. Like, there's something about dance and the way that the negative space between moving humans, and also the potential to deconstruct the expectations of how a body moves. That's what the audience brings to our work. When they bring their bodies, they bring their senses, their sense of smell, but also their stories and their sense of taste, and taste can be offended or disrupted. And I think that, that's how I feel when I'm the audience to your work. We went to Leeuwarden and saw your exhibit there, observing those works. You're not just watching it, you're not just thinking about it. You actually, there's an affinity, there's something is created between your videos and those objects with the people who, we kind of know how that feels. We've just never been in that situation when we know clay, we know what it's like to have a head, but to have this enormous weight and enclosure, and then spilling liquid, like how is the audience kind of implicit in your process?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up. The trip to the Ceramics Museum in Leeuwarden was so cathartic for me, and the reason is because that show was, because remember, we did our residency in it was around May, June, July 2021, and I'd hardly done a public show for for a year and a half during the pandemic, and so much of my clay stuff had been mediated via Instagram and like digitally. And no, that's kind of fine, but I didn't realize how much I missed the proper interaction with an audience in my work. And it was it just felt so great. I mean, for a start, we had such a fun road trip all the way up, because we went from one end of Holland to, Tilburg to Leeuwarden is pretty much the whole length of Holland, driving up and
I almost crashed in a car.
yeah, it was so much fun. And then when we were there, you really begin to notice the things like, so with me, it's my clay videos are projected onto a gallery wall. And then I've got a whole bunch of photos of you all sort of as you walk past, and then you're slightly sort of, as happens, you're sort of interrupting, like getting slightly in the way of the projector, and then there's a shadow, a silhouette that's cast over the screen, and things like that are great. But even things like, because I took so many photos because I was just so excited that day, even things like, I've got a couple of really nice photos of a few of you just laughing at some of the videos, because my video work is supposed to be, have a kind of slapstick humorous element, and my goodness, it felt just so wonderful then to have it, it's like, hooray, real people, they're seeing my work, and there are clay objects in here as well, and I can actually see a reaction, because I'd sort of been, like all of us, had been experiencing my work just sort of digitally and for a while. And so that was a really nice audience thing.
And I mean, the way that your work just embodied that sense of being isolated too, in the way that we had to inhabit not just our rooms, but also our own psychological spaces. You know, how claustrophobic your own mind can be in situations of stress. I think that it really hit a nerve with so many of us. It was great to experience that together as a group. It was I agree, it was super, super cathartic.
That was super fun. Yeah.
It's great to, my job now is to draw you to a close, I'm afraid, which will be disappointing for everybody, but it's so lovely to join you in this moment when you're talking about audiences and how they explore the work or how they become the work, and for you to have actually had this shared experience, a very important time for all of us. That it's incredible to understand through your conversation some of the motivations of making work that are unknown at the time making, but actually through being explored by the audience and the visitor, they tell you how to grow the work as well, which is fabulous. And it's great seeing both of your work climbing up the cameras as we speak. There's like the work, well, material as a catalyst, it's certainly like an algae forming in front of us in many ways. It's been amazing hearing you both talk, and thank you so much for being so open and sharing so openly your practices. And I think that anyone who's going to be watching this will have a real understanding why it's so important that you're both making work with material and thoroughly meditating with it and understanding it. So it's really, I just want to say a massive thank you to you both for joining us in the workshop series, and your video will be joining a whole host of other international workshops. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been really great.